Si has a run-in with the council. Si raised the cleaver and brought it down with practised precision on the carcass laid on the metal table in front of him. Mrs. Bradley stood watching him intently, her arms folded in silent judgment and lips pursed against her perception that in some way he was trying to cheat her. Mrs. Bradley was sure that the whole world was out to diddle her in some way, but Si knew how to handle his difficult customers. He smiled broadly and gave an irreverent wink. "All right there, my darling?" he asked. "We'll soon have those chops ready for you." He stood for a moment, cleaver in mid-strike. "Was it 6 chops you said, my lovely?" Mrs. Bradley wrapped her arms even tighter in defence of Si's friendliness. "That's right," she harumphed. "And make sure they're thick as well. And don't be putting no kidney in it. I'll be buggered if I'm paying the same price for kidney as for pork." Si smiled once more and swung his cleaver. "Oh, my dear me, no," he said jovially. "That'd just be awful." He guffawed at his joke and carried on with his butchering of the animal laid on his table. Mrs. Bradley watched keenly to make sure there was no trace of kidney left on the chops that she'd ordered. She left, having paid for her meat, and Si started to clean up the shop. Mrs. Bradley had not been the only one who had brought an air of hostility into his shop that day, and he was tired. As he scrubbed the table down with the antiseptic wash and emptied the bins, he contemplated the note that had landed on his doorstep that morning. Si was generally a happy man, pleasant and optimistic, but sometimes life had a way of kicking you in the face, and no matter how hard you tried, you just couldn't win. This was how Si was starting to feel with the council planning authorities right now. Around 9 months ago, Si had gone to the council to ask about getting an application to build a ramp on the pavement outside his house. His elderly mother had recently moved in with him after she'd had a particularly nasty fall. It seemed the easiest thing to do. At least that was how Si's sister had put it. She was married with 3 kids, and there was no way she could be fetching and carrying from Mum all the bloody time. "Not that Mum ever did any bloody fetching and carrying for me," she'd moaned. Si rolled his eyes and put on his brightest smile. There was no use arguing with his sister when she got going. He resigned himself to having his mother move in, and so move in she did. Straight away it had become clear that things were not going to be easy. Si's mother had started with her demands almost as soon as she'd sat on Si's favourite chair, shouting for and getting a cup of tea, declaring that, I couldn't possibly drink tea from a mug. Who do you think I am? A council estate dweller, for goodness sake? And so it had carried on. The latest was that his mother had demanded a ramp outside the house. Her best friend Agnes had just had one put in, and she had declared that Si's mother simply must have one too. After all, she said, what would happen if she had another fall? How would they get her to the ambulance? Si's mother immediately began a nagging campaign, threatening Si that if she fell without a ramp, the stress of worrying how she would get to the ambulance would be sure to bring on a heart attack. Si capitulated. He knew it would be the only way he'd ever get any peace, and he'd gone to speak to the housing officer in the council offices the very next day. She'd kindly informed Si there would be no planning permission needed, and he was free to sort it out himself. She helpfully gave him a list of council-approved builders. Si was pleasantly surprised. The whole process had only taken 3 weeks, and in the end had cost Si just short of £2,000. To be fair, Si thought, it's a small price to pay to shut his bloody mother up so he could get on with his life. Working in his butcher's shop was his pride and joy. All had gone well until that morning when he had received a letter from the council planning department. They'd informed him he was in breach of planning regulation outside ramps. Si was slightly concerned, but he was sure he could sort it out with a quick visit. After all, the lady behind the desk had told him no such permission would be needed, hadn't she? Si finished his clean-up job, locked up the shop, and caught the bus to town. He wasn't there for very long. The planning lady was virtually smirking as she informed him he was definitely in breach. "But the lady behind the desk," began Si. "Is a receptionist," finished the planning lady, "and as such has no authority whatsoever." It was at that point that Si spotted a sign on the planning lady's desk. "Vegan," it said. "Are you a vegan?" he stuttered. It was then he could take no more. For too long, bloody women had been making his life a misery. Well, he'd had enough. He took out his nice shiny cleaver, the good one that he usually used on Saturdays, and so the planning lady had no more need to worry about unplanned for lamps. The next day was Tuesday. Si placed the skinned and gutted carcass on his gleaming table. Mrs. Bradley was waiting outside for the shop to open. Si smiled broadly. Oh, Mrs. Bradley loved pork chops. They were on special today. The end.